Hello everyone and welcome to our webinar presentation. My name is Callie Knably. I am the Manager of Webinars for ICBA Independent Banker Magazine, and I will be the moderator for today's event. Depending on how much time we have today, at the end of the hour we'll be holding a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, and you can ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. However, if we do indeed run out of time, our presenters will directly respond to your question offline via email. And if you experience any technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of the slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources on the bottom left of your screen. Today's webinar is New York Cybersecurity Regulation, coming to a state near you, sponsored by All Covered. Our featured speakers are Patrick Wayland and Tara Spencer. Patrick Wayland is a strategic consultant focused on security, compliance, and infrastructure planning for community financial institutions. With the long-term strategy of our customers in mind, Patrick provides our financial clients with goals and pathways to align their IT infrastructure, processes, and capital outlay with the institution's vision. Mr. Wayland is responsible for engaging new institutions as well as providing strategic direction and ensuring customer satisfaction to their existing customer base. Mr. Wayland holds a BS from Quinnipiac University, I might have just butchered that name, and is an active member of the Association for Financial Technology and the ISACA. Tara Spencer is next, and she leads the Compliance Services team at All Covered. She has 25 years of financial, operational, and compliance audit and risk management expertise in the community banking space. Ms. Spencer is a certified community bank technology officer and a graduate of Muhlenberg College with a Bachelor of Arts in Accounting and Economics. So without any further ado, Patrick, I will turn the presentation over to you.
Great, thank you. Good afternoon and good morning to some. I appreciate your attendance to the webinar here. We always appreciate being able to give back some information to our ICBA member banks. Hopefully we have some relevant content today. The New York regs have been creeping up on us, and as most regs, that start in one state, we'll probably see these start to transition over to surrounding states and the remainder of the country, depending on the level of satisfactory compliance. So we're going to give a brief introduction to All Covered, give an understanding on who we are, what we do in the space. Then Tara's got some great content put together as far as the background, proposed rule versus the final rule, timeline to be in compliance with these new rules, discussion around each one of the requirements, and then the technological and compliance solutions that can kind of mitigate the risks that they're concerned around. And then at the end, we'll have conclusive statements as well as potential for some question and answer depending on time allotment. So a brief introduction to All Covered Finance. All Covered Finance is a division of Konica Minolta Solutions. All Covered is a managed services provider, but more specifically, the finance practice is really the division that works with community banks and credit unions following under FFIEC GLBA requirements. We have kind of the best of the both worlds. When you look at the national solutions and the National Center of Excellence we have built out to servicing financial institutions, and then being able to work hand in hand with local operations to be able to deploy up to 900 feet on the street engineers. Gives us kind of that local touch as well as that national expertise. We've been able to come up with a team of former bankers and security executives in order to put together suites of services that meet regulatory compliant needs, security, and information technology requirements. We're heavily ingrained in the finance space, so we're members of national, state, and local financial associations, ISCBA being one of those. And we successfully help hundreds of financial institutions on an annual basis go through internal audit and regulatory visits, which I call it a luxury to go through a regulatory audit on a daily basis, but it does help to improve our solutions and our go-to-market strategy. So we kind of formulate our services based upon feedback that we get from our core customer base, and we're typically looking at the, all the headlines that, what keeps bank presidents up at night, things of that nature. And we always see kind of the same gist as reputation being number one, closely followed by compliance and cybersecurity. So with that in mind, we kind of formulate our position in the market as being able to answer that question is, are we secure and are we compliant, which in turn could affect reputation. So in order to put that to rest and answer those questions, you need to know certain things to determine, are we compliant and are we secure? In order to do so, you need to have some visibility into the process. So without having visibility, it's tough to say if you're good or bad. But once you get that visibility into those internal controls, the different practices, the way things are set up, and the way that you conduct business, that in turn empowers executive management to make the appropriate decisions in order to better protect your organization and ultimately customer non-public private information. So at the end of the day, that's really our motto and what we strive to do. Supporting roles in that, we started off as a local integrator focused on designing workstations, servers, internal LAN, things of that nature in order to put the first computers in branches 30 plus years ago now. With that adoption, you had some devices on site and there was a more adoption of the actual utilization of those devices. It's then the requirement to empower the users to actually use them. So you start getting into outsourced IT services in order to better manage those networks to ensure that the users can adequately use the devices and technology put in place. After that, you get into cybersecurity services. Once you start that adoption process and putting more and more things onto these systems, it's important to protect that information, which really got amplified when GLBA came out, which really got us into the business of IT compliance and being able to document and ensure that customer non-public private information is actually being protected. And as of recently, some regulatory changes have allowed us to get into a new space, the Information Security Advisory Services. This is really the segregation of duties between technology and security and being able to support the arm of your organization that oversees technology to ensure that customer non-public private information is being protected. So with that, I'm going to turn over to Tara, who's going to educate and open up some conversations around the New York cybersecurity regulations.
Thank you, Patrick. As Director of Compliance Services at All Covered, I get to work primarily in that ISO advisory capacity. We have a team of people that assist our clients and customers across the nation with cybersecurity, risk assessment, policy documentation, all of those things that your regulator wants to see you do that may not come easily to you, we can help with. So when we were talking about having a topic for this webinar, obviously the New York cybersecurity regulations have gotten nationwide attention. And not only do we have customers in that space, we agree with many of the other analysts out there that are saying that these regs are going to basically filter up to the federal level. There are a lot of best practices here. There are a lot of requirements that are the same as the current FFIEC guidance, and I'll try to focus on those as we move through the slides and call out what might be different or what might be a little bit more stringent than what we're currently required to do in the community banking space. So I thought I'd start out with some of the cybersecurity events leading up to the New York regulation. As community bankers, we know, and every conference we go to, we hear about all the cyber crime that's going on, all the hacks that have occurred over the past several years. I just pulled out a few here on this slide that focus in on either financial services or the government space, because that's really, those two spaces are what drive the banking regulations. We had the SWIFT hack, which was millions of dollars. Those of you who do international wire transfers are familiar with that system, I'm sure. We had the U.S. Department of Justice with FBI employees and Department of Homeland Security employees having their data compromised. back in June 2015, not only did we have personal information compromised, we had biometric data stolen from millions of federal workers. And then not to let any of the banks off the hook, we had the huge JP Morgan Chase incident where we had 76 million households' information compromised. So it's really in response to all of the cybercrime that New York, as the financial capital of the world, Governor Cuomo's words, decided to take action and put into place cybersecurity regulations that are meant to protect customer information, protect businesses, and protect our financial system from the threat of cybercrime. He did call out these are first in the nation, and many other states are looking at these regulations. The federal government, the FFIC, whether you're FDIC regulated, OCC regulated, these were first in the nation, but already included some of the requirements that we already, as community banks, are required to do. However, it is expected, based on the current environment, that these will become across-the-board requirements for all community banks. I included a quote here from the New York Department of Financial Services superintendent. She goes on to call out the consumer portion of this. Similar to the regulations that we're used to, like Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, there's a huge focus on protecting our customers' information. And up until now, that has really been the primary key to information security. For many of us, that means information that's on our core. These regulations take this a step further and cover other types of information, which we'll get into. But I wanted to call out that there's still a huge focus on our customer, and as financial services companies, as community banks, our responsibility to protect their information. Just one other note on New York State, considering themselves the leader from a cybersecurity perspective, they actually did put in a bachelor's degree program in the State University of New York and University of Albany that focuses on cybersecurity, homeland security, and emergency preparedness, which I thought was very interesting. We do a lot of work in the business continuity space and incident response space. So here you have the regulatory authority kind of combining that all into an education program. And one other point of recent news, I think this came out actually yesterday, they've actually, to this regulation that we're talking about today, they've added credit reporting agencies based on the Equifax hack. So they are on top of it. They're really trying to do everything they can, at least from a state perspective, to make sure that they're at the forefront of cybersecurity. So I thought it might be helpful to talk about the proposed rule versus the final rule. I don't often do this when it comes to FDIC regulation or the Federal Register versions of proposed rules, but I thought it was important to highlight that there was a lot of feedback to the original regulation that came out in September 2016. There were over 150 comments, and it was a really short window. I think it was a 3-month window for financial services companies to get their comments back to the regulator. Typically with FDIC, you have a much broader window than that. But in that 3 months, they did make significant modifications. And most of the modifications have to do with making sure that the requirements are risk-based. So if you read the proposed version of the reg, everything's very straightforward. You're required to do this. Financial institution has to do that. In the final rule, you'll notice that everything is written according to risk. And if you're in the banking space, you know that everything that we do is governed by risk assessment and risk management. So it comes into line much more with the other guidance we're used to reading around FFIC, information security guidelines and such, where you do have the flexibility based on your environment and based on the way that you do business to have some leeway within the rules. The key, though, is that you have to document them appropriately. So some of the primary modifications, the financial institution's entire cybersecurity program is based on the risk assessment. We also have requirements for penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. multifactor authentication, and encryption being based on risk as well. So in the original version of the reg, those were all requirements. Now you can talk about the risk to your environment and the way you do business, document that in your risk assessment, and then state whether or not you need to implement those controls based on your risk. A couple other changes I wanted to call out from the proposed rule to the final rule. Certain of the minimum requirements also were reduced from an annual requirement to periodically. Periodically is a risk term that we use when we do a risk assessment and make sure that anything that we're calling out in the risk assessment, we test according to the actual risk inherent and documented in the risk assessment. So it gives you some flexibility there. Everyone doesn't have to do everything every year. There can be a periodic nature to some of the requirements. They also put in confidentiality safeguards. There's a lot of documentation required by this regulation. As community banks, sometimes that's concerning because once you document something, you're definitely held accountable to that. So there were safeguards put into place so that banks do not have to disclose some of this information. Unless you're already required to by your federal regulator, you're not required to go above and beyond that for some of the rules that they put in place here. You do have to maintain documentation for 5 years. That was added to the final rule from the proposed rule. It's a huge, as I said, emphasis on documentation, and you have to have all this available for when you get examined by the New York Department of Financial Services. So the rule went into effect March 1st, 2017. I put together a timeline for compliance so that you can see by date what parts of the regulation are required to be in effect at your institution. The regulation itself, if you read through, it's not organized this way, so it can be a little bit confusing. Even though the regulation went into effect March 1st, 2017, there was an initial 180-day window, which brought most of the initial requirements to September 1st, 2017. So we just passed that deadline. And we'll go through each of these in detail, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide. But the first, there's 4 tiers of compliance. There's the first, which is the 180-day window, and then the rest they call transition periods. So they're cognizant that some of the financial institutions may not have this information or may not have this structure in place yet, so they wanted to give some time to be able to put these controls in place. And if you're not going to have each of the controls, they wanted to have time to implement implementation and to document it in your risk assessment if you're not going to do it. So we have a window from September 1st, 2017 is the first through March 1st, 2019. Okay, so let's delve a little bit into each of the requirements. Starting with the Cybersecurity Program. And actually, before I talk about the program elements, I just wanted to make a side note that the regulation itself talks about covered entity throughout the document. That's the definition they use to talk about who needs to comply with the cybersecurity rules. For us on this call, community banks are definitely included, but it's actually much broader than the banking space. It includes insurance, finance companies, basically any company that is chartered or licensed under New York banking law, insurance law, or financial services law. Again, they just added credit reporting agencies as well. So it is much broader than what we're used to, but it certainly does concern the community banks and the banking space. So we'll start off with the cybersecurity program elements. We're all probably familiar with information security and the key tenets, which is confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems. Key to this, again, and you're going to hear me say this over and over on the call, for almost everything that you're documenting, it should be based on the risk assessment and it should line up with your risk assessment. So the cybersecurity program needs to be in alignment with your risk assessment, and it needs to address 6 key components. You need to make sure that the cybersecurity includes the identification and assessment of internal and external risks that may threaten your data. Non-public information, let's talk about that. It's a little bit different term. We're used to hearing about non-public personal information under Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act. This actually is a little bit broader than GLBA. It includes employee data. It includes business data that if someone were to get their hands on it, it could hurt your business. So it is a little bit, again, broader than GLBA in that it's not just talking about your customer data. So the cybersecurity program needs to cover risks that threaten any non-public information that's stored on your information systems. It also requires the use of defensive infrastructure. So it's not enough to just monitor and detect and react. You are expected to have defensive controls in place to prevent the compromise of your systems from unauthorized use and malicious acts. The cybersecurity program must also be able to detect cybersecurity events, respond to identify or detected cybersecurity events, and mitigate any negative effects. Recovery. It has to include recovery elements. So when you're thinking about your incident response plan, when you're thinking about your backup plan, you have to have the ability to restore, especially when thinking about things like ransomware. You need to be able to restore back to normal operations and services, and that must be part of the program. And of course, you have to fulfill all of your regulatory reporting obligations. So not just New York State obligations, but of course your FFIEC required obligations as well. The cybersecurity program, all your documentation related to it has to be made available to your regulator upon request. So one thing that I thought was interesting when these regulations came out, there was a statement made that it's going to be examined and enforced pretty much immediately. So as we all probably know, usually there's a kind of like an implementation window as far as, okay, well, the examiners need to update their audit program, so they won't really be covering certain elements until the next audit or the next year. In this case, they were very clear that the examiners had already had their programs updated, so we need to make sure we're on top of the deadlines here to be ready for them. Okay, the second element we're going to talk about is your cybersecurity policy. So sometimes banks get confused between policy and program. Program is really the overall umbrella that all of your controls, your risk assessments, your documentation, your policies roll up under. The policy itself is the document that you're taking to the board to have approved that includes certain elements of the program, but it's basically your written guidelines. So we call our information security policy a program because you have multifaceted policies that may roll up under one. You want to make sure it's approved by the board of directors or the IT steering committee of the board. The New York regulation actually allows for senior management approval. Again, that's because it's written for a broader audience. Definitely in the banking space, you need to have it approved by the board of directors. You also want to make sure that it sets forth your policies and procedures. And again, procedures can be incorporated in by reference, not that you have to take the detailed step-by-step procedures to the board. But you need to make sure it includes the protection of information systems, non-public information, again, the broader definition there, and make sure it ties into your cybersecurity risk assessment. Some additional considerations, you need to make sure it covers information security, data governance, and classification. Data classification is something that a lot of smaller community banks kind of struggle with, something we actually help some of our banks with, and that's making sure that the organization of your data on your networks is done with a focus towards non-public private information. So that's something that does need to be included in your policy. You need to make sure you have asset inventory and device management included, access controls and identity management, your business continuity and disaster recovery planning and resources. Usually that's a separate document, but it needs to have cybersecurity elements and be rolled up into the program. You need to talk about system operations and availability of systems and system and network security. In addition, just a few more things, and I'll not read through each of these as you can see them on the slide here. I just wanted to call out vendor management and third-party service provider management. There's been so much focus on vendor management over the last 5 years or so, and this regulation is no anomaly from that. And we'll talk a little bit about the requirements. But you need to make sure your vendor management policy includes third-party service provider elements and includes cybersecurity, and there's some stronger requirements in this regulation than we've seen in the past from the SSIEC. Again, the risk assessment needs to be identified and cross-referenced in the policy, as well as your incident response program. Okay, let's talk about the requirement for a Chief Information Security Officer. This was huge. There has been a lot of urging by the federal regulators to make sure that you have someone in this role, someone that is independent of your information technology officer or your CIO. This put it basically in writing that you need to have a qualified individual that's implementing your program, and they call out the title. It needs to be a Chief Information Security Officer. Now the good news is they do allow you to use a third-party service provider to assist you with that. So in some ways they did give you a little bit of wiggle room, but the role itself does definitely need to be in place in the institution. If you look at each slide as I go through here, you'll see that there's a small effective date down in the bottom right-hand corner. Those correspond to the timeline that was on the previous slide. So while you're required to have a CISO effective September 1st, the CISO does not have to report to the board or do their first report to the board until March 1st, 2018 is the deadline. So they do give you a little bit of wiggle room here to get someone responsible for information security in place at your organization, whether it's a third party or someone internally, and to formulate your first report to the board. Now, it needs to be done at least annually. We're seeing more banks report more often just because there is so much always happening in the cybersecurity space, and the controls around information security are so important. We're starting to see a little bit more frequent reporting than annually, but this regulation requires it annually, as does your FSIEC information security guidance and also the GLBA. So for this report to the board, we're already required as banks to do the annual information security report to the board under the GLBA. So all of us should be familiar with that. Typically, it's done by the Chief Information Officer. Your head of IT may present it, or your Chief Operating Officer. So what you need to include from a New York perspective, and what's a little bit different, is number one, the type of information. So it's not just centered on customer data. It's the non-public information, which is the broader spectrum that we talked about. Policies and procedures, we need to make sure that cybersecurity is included in there. So typically, we're making sure that the information security program is going to the board, and that is always in your GLBA report. You just need to make sure that the cybersecurity elements are also called out in that. Material cyber risk to the financial institution. Right now, GLBA requires you to report on the risk assessment, the information security risk assessment, so you just want to make sure that your cybersecurity is incorporated into that, or you can do a separate cybersecurity risk identification. You definitely want to report on the attestation of how effective your cybersecurity program is. Under the GLBA, we call it an information security program, and we attest to the effectiveness of that program. In this case, you want to specifically call out the cybersecurity elements of that. And then last but not least, any material cybersecurity events that occurred during the time period need to be called out as well. Cybersecurity events as defined in the regulation, in the New York regulation, is a pretty big window. It actually talks about any attempt at accessing your information systems, any unauthorized access attempt. Under the cybersecurity reporting requirement, though, it's similar to GLBA, where it needs to be something that occurred that could have potentially compromised the data or caused harm to the bank. Okay, we're going to move on to the next requirement. This is around penetration testing and vulnerability assessments. These requirements go into effect March 1st of 2018, so we have a little bit of a window left here. I just wanted to call out something that comes up quite often for us is when we're talking about penetration testing and vulnerability assessments, a lot of times they're packaged together by your service provider, and there's some confusion around which is which. So in this regulation, they are called out separately and for good reason. The vulnerability assessments, we're seeing that the regulators want you to do them more often than annually. This regulation requires it to be done biannually. A lot of services out there are doing them monthly or quarterly. And the vulnerability assessment is basically a program that you're running to detect any missing patches, any vulnerability within your systems, either whether it's your perimeter defense or whether it's your internal systems, that could allow a potential hack to occur. The penetration testing side is more stringent and intense. Basically, there's a person trying to hack your systems. So that's the biggest difference between those two items. They are both required by the regulation. Penetration test is required annually, and then the vulnerability assessments are required periodically based on your risk assessment. So it's important to include them both in your risk assessment as a detection control, but also to differentiate between them. One other note on the vulnerability assessments is vulnerability assessment tools typically come up with a lot of vulnerabilities. And they typically score them by risk from high to low. So you want to make sure that any critical vulnerability that comes up on any of these reports is remediated and also reported back to your board of directors as remediated. It's not enough just to have them done. You have to have the follow-up in place to show that you're taking action on anything that's detected. The audit trail requirement. This has an effective date of September 1st, 2018. So there's kind of two pieces to the audit trail requirement. One is, and that's the first bullet point there, is making sure that your systems are designed to reconstruct material financial transactions. Now, this is something that is already in place at banks. It's been part of the Bank Secrecy Act requirement for 30 years or so, and that's your record retention on financial transactions of your customers. So most of the people on this call should already have that one covered as far as being able to reconstruct any of that data and the record retention around that data. Most of us have core service providers that help us with that. The second item on here is audit trails designed to detect and respond to cyber events that have a reasonable likelihood of material harming any part of your normal operations. So this is the second piece to this is a little bit harder. This is all your other documentation that you're going to have in place around your cybersecurity program, and also concerns reporting from whatever tools you may have in place as part of your defensive posture around cybersecurity. So if you put a tool in place, for instance, if you implement a security event monitoring system, you need to make sure that you're looking at the reports and retaining the reports and acting on the reports. So it's not enough to just kind of put it in place and say you have it. You need to make sure you can prove to an examiner or an auditor that you have it in place, you're monitoring it, and you're acting on it. And again, we have that 5-year requirement for record retention. We'll talk a little bit about data destruction further on as well, because there's some interesting requirements around making sure that you're not keeping too much data available either. Okay, the next requirement is access privileges. These went into effect September 1st of 2017. Many community banks should already have this in place, especially on your core. You should have all of your employees divided into groups, and the group should be assigned responsibilities based on their job duties for your access to your core. What's interesting about this and what makes this a little bit more stringent is it's not just your core, it's your network as well. So this again brings back the data classification. You need to make sure that people in your bank that have access to customer information really need to have that access. Not just customer information, but for New York banks, also any kind of business confidential information should also be restricted. And then we have also a review requirement. So those of you on the call who are either FDICA compliant or SEC compliant, you're public, have to have your SOX controls in place. you're used to performing this review, typically it was done annually. We've seen a lot of banks move to biannually on this. Again, this regulation says periodic, so you do have some flexibility based on your risk assessment. And you would want to look at things like how often your environment changes, how much turnover you may have in certain areas to guide you as far as how often you need to review that access. I think the access reviews are best done the best approach to the access reviews is not to just hand it off to your head of operations or your head of IT, but to include the managers and hold them accountable for making sure that their people have access to only what they need based on their job duties. So it is a process to have in place if you want it to work effectively and be a good control. You want to include the department managers. Application security. This really is speaking to any type of financial services or insurance companies that have developed their own software and have their own systems within the institution. I haven't seen it a lot in the community banking space, but there is a requirement also for evaluating any externally developed applications. So we're not talking about making sure you're testing, the latest version of a widely used software like Word or something like that. We're talking more about any of those other solutions that you may independently contract for with a company. You probably already have very stringent vendor due diligence around those types of solutions, but this is just adding into that, making sure that you've documented that and that you've tested that prior to introducing it into your environment. I just put a note on here. It's a good idea to include these elements within your information security program and policy documentation. So even if you're not a bank that typically does this, you have it covered and you're addressing it within your elements of coverage for your policy documents. All right, so let's move on to risk assessment. This is an area that I am very fond of, being in the risk industry. But the cybersecurity risk assessment is something that has gotten a lot of focus over the last few years from the FSIEC. If you haven't been asked to produce your FSIEC cybersecurity assessment tool, you will be, definitely, at the next examination. Most of our banks have been asked to produce that during an exam. Their examiners are still not saying that it's required. But certainly it is asked for and is very strongly recommended that you at least try it at the baseline level to identify your cybersecurity risk. In addition to that, the New York regulations have put into effect an annual requirement. The annual requirement is really based on New York regs at this time. However, the FSIEC and FDIC, depending on the frequency of your exams, would most likely like to see it annually as well. And that's typically how often we do it for our customers when they ask for help with it. But I will say it should be done as often as necessary to address big changes. So if you're going through a merger or you're acquiring another branch, or if you're doing anything that's going to have an impact on your information systems in a big way, you want to make sure that you are going back to that document and revising it, because the last thing you want is to either miss a control or have an examiner ask you, look at your documentation and say, well, what about, what just happened 3 months ago to your environment, and not be able to speak to it. So you want to make sure that you can revise your controls, responding to technological developments, and also as new threats come out. So there are a lot of websites out there that when the last cyber crime occurs, they'll broadcast lessons learned, and you can learn a lot from that. Even in putting this webinar together and looking at some of the hacks, I learned a lot about what you can do to prevent certain what was exploited to be able to let them in. A lot of times it's social engineering, and it's phishing and clicking on email links. That's a huge part of it, and we'll talk about training in a little bit to mitigate that. But so that's something, too, to consider as you're doing your risk assessment, making sure that as evolving threats are present, that you're updating and including those in your analysis. You also want to make sure that you're considering the particular risk of your business. So there are risk assessment tools out there that are very general in nature, and you could kind of produce a document using them, but you do need to spend the time to make sure it's tailored to your environment. You don't get much value out of it if it's just a canned solution. You do need to make sure it's tailored. Some other requirements for the risk assessment: non-public information collected or stored. So again, it's that broader range. It's not just your customer information. You need to accommodate all the non-public information that's in your information systems. And you must have a documented methodology. So I can speak to the Cybersecurity Risk Assessment, Information Security Risk Assessment that All Covered produces. I have used some other risk assessment methods in the past at banks that I've worked at, where you basically back into it and make sure that everything that is in the risk assessment makes sense to what your program looks like. This is meant to counteract that type of approach. So our cybersecurity risk assessment at All Covered includes a documented methodology that covers the criteria for evaluation, categorizing the risks and threats. This is very detailed and drilling down into the methodology that you use for risk assessment in the New York rules. And I do expect that this will be adopted by the federal regulators as well, because from a methodology perspective, it has to make sense, or else the results of the risk assessment are going to be questionable. I'm going to speed up a little bit here. I have a lot of information to talk about. So the next requirement, cybersecurity personnel. So this is a little bit difficult, right? We have trouble sometimes making sure that our people are continued to be educated. And especially in a realm of cybersecurity where everything changes almost on a daily basis, you want to make sure that anyone that is working with your third-party service provider, if you do designate a CISO internally and they wear other hats, you want to make sure that they're adequately trained, and make sure not just that you send them to training, but also that they are kept up to date, that they have subscriptions that they're using, and they go to events, and basically keeping up to date with any of the emerging risks. They should be able to talk to an examiner about the current cybersecurity environment. So let's talk about your third-party service providers. Third-party service provider policy is what's called out in the New York regulation. It's really your vendor management policy with an expanded section on third-party service providers. So you want to make sure that the elements that you currently have in your vendor management policy comply with the more stringent recommendations within these rules. The biggest difference is there's a huge emphasis on not just information security from a GLBA perspective. It's been years now that we've been required to include GLBA language in our contracts, and also make sure that you have your red flags in there as well. But now we want to also make sure we're tying your third-party service provider and holding them accountable for having cybersecurity controls if they have access to your customer data or any non-public information that is accessible to them. So as you're doing your risk assessments, many of us have kind of like a three-tier risk assessment process in place for our vendors. Make sure you're including cybersecurity as an element. Make sure you're holding them to minimum cybersecurity practices to be able to do business with you. You want to make sure in your due diligence process that you're asking for their cybersecurity policies, asking for tests of cybersecurity so you can get some kind of assurance that they have good controls in place, and also that you're periodically reviewing that information. So all of us have programs where we periodically go over our vendor information. We want to make sure that we're going over not just your business licenses, your financial viability, and the other things that we typically look at, but also a big emphasis on the cybersecurity piece of it. Okay. Periodic review and assessment of third-party service providers. This is where the regulation gets even more detailed and intricate around what they want you to be looking at. You want to make sure you're looking at multi-factor authentication, and are they using it? They need to address it within their policy. So what I can see happening here is typically when you're doing vendor management, you'll ask for their policies. They may or may not provide their information security or their cybersecurity policy, so you'll have to ask for that specifically. And then when you're looking at it, you may have some back and forth to call out these individual requirements to make sure that they have them in place if their risk assessment calls for it. So again, you're almost auditing your third-party service provider. You want to make sure that they're using encryption where they need to or where you expect them to. Definitely you want to have language in your agreements that require them to give you notice of a cybersecurity event that may impact your information systems or your customer data, any non-public information that they have access to, and the rep and warranties. They're looking for you to have rep and warranty language within your contracts with third-party service providers. And again, this is focused on third-party service providers that have access to your non-public information. So big focus on data processors, companies like All Covered that may be managing your systems and may be able to access your data. We are not at the level of the data processor, but certainly we have, in doing network information and doing your risk assessments, we have access to that information as well. So make sure that your vendor management policy, the takeaway there, is inclusive of these more stringent requirements. And you do have quite a window on this one. This was March 1st, 2019. It's in the last year. All right, just a few more requirements here. We're almost at the top of the hour, so I'm going to hand it over to Patrick in just a couple of minutes here. Multi-factor authentication. For those of us in the community banking space, most of us probably have had this discussion with the regulator surrounding anybody that's accessing the network from home or from an external location. So if you're VPNing in, you want to make sure we have multi-factor authentication. The New York reg asks you, based on risk, to also determine whether or not that should be required in addition to external, in other words, internal. Data retention limits. New York requires policies and procedures for secure disposal. Many of us already have this as a required element. I think it was maybe 7 or 8 years ago that especially the FDIC was pushing banks to make sure they have proper destruction of customer information in place. What's interesting here is it's basically a requirement to destroy that data when it's no longer necessary for operations. So we have our regulatory requirement to maintain data for a certain number of years, whether it's 5 years for BSA, 7 years for financial transactions. If you're an SEC bank, you have different retention requirements. This would affect your email systems as well. Internal email often contains non-public information. And it's actually just a best practice. Working in banks, we don't like to get rid of anything. And it actually does, though. It opens you to risks, not just regulatory risk in this case, but also legal risk, especially when it concerns emails and documentation. Training and monitoring, there's 2 different dates listed here for effective dates. Risk-based policies, procedures, and controls designed to monitor activity of authorized users. There are solutions that we have available to report on use and authorized versus unauthorized. That's effective September 1st, 2018. But your cybersecurity awareness training for all personnel is effective March 1st, 2018. So most of our clients that we have now do have annual cybersecurity training. And we're actually moving towards more of a more frequent training as well, just because so much of the cybercrime occurs based on employee interaction, whether it's a phishing email or other types of social engineering. Data encryption. This is one that we've been getting a lot of questions on, and it was one that was actually loosened in the final rule. So the original rule said encryption of data in transit and at rest. They went back and revised that, especially considering that encryption solutions companies are only just now putting together packages to expand some of their service offerings and capabilities around encryption at rest. It's one thing to encrypt a laptop, it's another thing to encrypt a server. So there is wiggle room built into this. Not only is the effective date September 1st, 2018, but it also does allow you to address it in your risk assessment. So if you have compensating controls in place, if you have good controls that you feel confident that your server is not going to be walked out of your server room and infiltrated, or any other compensating controls that you may have in place from a technology perspective, to protect that data other than encrypting the entire drive, you can reference that in your risk assessment. The key here also is there's an annual review that's required by your CISO if you choose not to encrypt. Okay, your incident response plan, I won't talk too much about this because all banks currently are required to have an incident response plan based on GLBA requirements. I just listed in here the requirements of the New York regs so that you can review your incident response plan and make sure these elements, which are also best practice, are included in your current incident response plan that you have in effect under GLBA. And last but not least are the notices. So one of the big issues that all of us have, I think, when there's a cyber crime that occurs and data is compromised, we always find out about it 6 months, 9 months, you know, there's a huge window there between when it's detected and when it's reported. So New York is trying here to limit that to, you know, give 72 hours from determination, at least to them as a regulatory agency. And again, cybersecurity event is described more broadly in the regulation to include any attempt, successful or unsuccessful. From a notice requirement, it is required to be provided to any government body, self-regulatory agency, or any other supervisory body. So that's your first tier, what needs to have notice. The second is it needs to have a reasonable likelihood of materially harming any part of normal operation. So they do put more stringent requirements on the notice than the actual definition within the regulation. And then last but not least is on an annual basis, you must certify to the Department of Financial Services superintendent that your information security, your cybersecurity program is in compliance with the rules. So that you have to maintain for 5 years. Again, not just the certification, but everything you're doing to comply with the rules needs to be included. Okay, so that kind of wraps up the requirements. I know there was a lot of information that I crammed in there, so I hope it was helpful to all of you. And again, we're open for questions. Even if we run out of time here, we'll be happy to answer any questions for you. And I'll turn it over to Patrick for a few minutes here to talk about how we could potentially help you become compliant with the rules.
Thank you, Tara. A great, very specific expectation on what they're looking for compliance with, so I appreciate that. So all covered as a managed services provider really hangs its hat on our ability to be a consultant. So although the New York regs call out some very specific requirements, I think the value that all covered can bring to every organization that's a part of today's call is the ability to consult and the ability to answer any questions that you might have in regards to the regs and what the best course of action might be, working hand in hand with you to, potentially go through the risk assessment, go through, what's required and what the best solutions to fulfill the future requirements are. Now, this is not an exhaustive list of how all covered can help, but a few things off the list here is the Written Information Security Program requirement. Tara has a team full of folks that can work with you to customize and create the IT security program in order to adequately meet and describe compliance requirements as well as mitigating risk and controls in the organization. The cybersecurity risk assessment, although it's stemmed from the GLBA IT risk assessment as a self-assessment, Tara's team's worked with numerous organizations, I would say probably over 100 at this point, in going through and educating and being able to provide that compliance expertise as well as that consultative advice in order to make those run as smoothly as possible. You typically, call a lot of department heads that are pulled from their day-to-day business, so making that time as efficient as possible is paramount. And then we have the ability to do a lot of the legwork on the back end, create all the necessary reporting. Cybersecurity training. We've definitely run into a few organizations that have, used the same slide deck year over year to try to educate their employees on current quote unquote security threats. So keeping that information timely, I think, is paramount, and keeping top of mind is second in importance. In order to provide timely information that when that email or that potential malicious whatever comes by, they're going to have that training top of mind. Managed vulnerability scanning being something that we've seen regulators look to do much more frequently. First getting into the industry, we saw pen test, vulnerability assessments, and social engineering done annually, and you'd wipe your hands and think about it next year. Where we've gotten to the point where we're today doing this on a monthly basis and then doing remediation to try to limit the footprint of malicious potential within your network. And then I guess the umbrella statement and the all-encompassing conversation comes around our Virtual Information Security Officer Advisory Services, where we can support that individual who is tasked with that CIS role or CISO role, providing them with technologies and tools as well as consultative advice in order to be adequate in performing those tasks at the institution, both in assisting in board reporting as well as project plan and compliance. So a lot of capabilities that we have in supporting that role to make sure it's effective. We talked very specifically about the New York regs today and the future requirements. I think that if there's some confusion on where your organization stands today, not only from the New York regs, but just from compliance as a whole, we go through what's considered a baseline information security assessment, which is really going through the standard process of an assessment from need gathering and verification as well as reporting and then recommended solutions or feedback. So we typically will start our relationships out with a scenario like this, and this helps not only from the regs, but also getting a good baseline on where you stand today, so you have a level of comfort, both from a compliance standpoint and a cybersecurity standpoint. Are you just doing regulatory requirements? Are you doing best practices? Where do you stand there? So it's a great way to get started and answer any questions you have on your current baseline. Typically this is a $4,500 flat fee. Our organization is doing a promotional item for the next few months here where we'll be able to credit that back if you were to, let's say, do an ongoing managed services with us. So if you're planning on doing business with us anyway, we can give you a free assessment. If nothing else, you have a small capital outlay to get a peace of mind and a baseline on where you stand. Right, so that just defines the offer, and as you have the ability to download the presentation, you have the documentation and the language that is supported with that offer. And then as always, being an ICBA preferred service provider, we do offer a 5% discount on our managed services to all ICBA member banks. With that, I think that's the end of our regularly scheduled announcement. I thank Tara, and we'll turn it back over to the folks at the ICBA.
All right, perfect. Thank you so much, Patrick and Tara, for your presentation. And that's all the time we have for today. So on behalf of ICBA, I wanted to thank you guys again and for sharing your expertise with us today. And of course, we ran up to the end of the hour, so if we didn't get a chance to answer the attendee questions, one of your questions, our presenters will personally follow up with you via email. So just a couple housekeeping announcements before signing off. We will be sending out a link to the recording of today's webinar to anyone who registered, so monitor your inboxes and stay tuned. And again, if you would like a copy of today's presentation, you may download a PDF version of it by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Events Resources on the bottom left of your screen. This concludes our webinar today. Thanks for joining us.